Hi everybody, you've reached Lecture 6, Sexuality and the Construction of Phobia, to be completed by Sunday, June 26th. Now in Lecture 5 we covered the major differences between sex, which is defined biologically and chromosomally and has historically been used as a category of identity, and gender, which is socially constructed and has historically been used as a means to create a hierarchy privileging the male sex over the female. Now, in today's lecture, we also want to further unpackage and complicate the term sex, although this time we're not differentiating sex from gender, but differentiating sex from sexuality. Now, in its broadest sense, sexuality refers to sexual attraction and orientation, or perhaps put another way, the conditions of being sexual. At first glance, the contrast between sex and sexuality may resemble the differences between sex and gender. One appears to be biologically defined, the other is socially constructed. But that comparison is problematic because human sexuality is not only related to the external social environment one inhabits, but is also produced by biological urges which impel human beings to mate and seek physical and emotional harmony with another or others. However, to say that sexuality is not influenced by the social constructions of gender and gender roles ignores the powerful ways in which media and society both shape and reinforce discourses around what society deems to be normative or normalized sexual behavior. Now, as we're going to see in this lecture, discussing and analyzing the differences between sex and sexuality, as well as the nuances which exist between both categories, it is a really difficult task. And this is because the United States is one of many Western cultures in which open discussions and expressions of sexuality are still considered taboo, perhaps even more so than race, gender, or class. Thus, Americans, as well as many cultures around the world, are conditioned to fear and disavow sexuality from a very early age. Obscenity statutes prevent us from displaying our bodies openly in public, and institutions like the Motion Picture Association of America, the MPAA, still use guidelines assigning an arbitrary age limit at which it becomes socially acceptable to witness sexually explicit images. Now, as critical scholars of diversity, we can probably recognize that this is an example of patriarchal thinking, seeking to remove the fundamental difference in human identity as a way of overlooking historical practices of oppression and discrimination. And also, as scholars of history, however, we can also recognize this attitude as an influence of Victorian Puritanism. Which throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries reiterated the Judeo-Christian belief that engaging in sexual intercourse, as well as demonstrating any real kind of visible manifestation of sexuality, was essentially tantamount to surrendering to temptation and sin and damnation. So, the consequences of the patriarchal and puritanical understanding of human sexuality have rendered today's 21st century climate one of presumed assumptions, carefully crafted semantics, and discomfort, which often feeds into hostility and aggression. Now, perhaps the biggest source of this confusion and misunderstanding is that of sexual orientation. The term sexual orientation itself illustrates the difficulties in precisely articulating human sexuality. It's preferable to the outdated notion of a sexual preference, which carries an unconscious assumption that humans can treat their sexual urges and impulses as something that they can freely pick and choose on any given day. On the other hand, sexual orientation may still be reductive since it infers that the entire spectrum of human sexual desire can be narrowed into the two stable, binaries of male and female. Thus, many gender theorists use the term sexual object choice, which may be closer to the ideal of openness and assumes a broader range of sexual behavior, not just heterosexuality or homosexuality, but also bisexuality, pansexuality, which is a sexual attraction not based on stable gender binaries, or asexuality, which is the absence of any sexual attraction to anything or anyone. But the term sexual object choice also carries the assumption of free choice, like sexual preference, and may also be confusing if used within everyday language and parlance. So, although imperfect, sexual orientation, for the sake of clarity, is the term that we're going to use to refer to the ways in which individuals organize and categorize their personal sexual attractions. So, The patriarchal and the puritanical condemnations of sexuality also had real damaging effects on the medical and scientific attempts to understand it. Now, in the 19th century, most physicians believed that everyone was born heterosexual in some essentialized way, but they did theorize that gay men really were female souls somehow trapped in a man's body, while lesbians were male souls trapped in a female body. This was what was known as the gender inversion model, and it served as a pretty faulty idea, but it was a primitive way of distinguishing between sexual identity and gender identity. And I, I realize that that picture of the Flintstones might come off as weird uh, because it's not from the 19th century, and Fred Flintstone wasn't gay necessarily, but it kind of illustrates this idea that the idea of a soul being an influential part of one's building one's identity was really kind of a primitive and now that we look back on it, a pretty silly idea. So, but emblematic of the sort of medical discourses that you saw in sexuality in the 19th century. So, in the second half of the 20th century, two dominant models have sought to theorize the source of sexual orientation. Now, the first model is known as the biological or essentialist model of sexuality, and it proposes that sexuality is genetically determined. It states that sexual orientation is hardwired from birth in the same manner that being right-handed or left-handed is, or being born with blue eyes or brown eyes. Okay, it's all hereditary based, it's genetically determined, it's biologically hardwired. The second model, known as the social constructionist model, argues that people are born without a hardwired sexual orientation at birth and are subsequently shaped into heterosexuality, homosexuality, or various other sexuality through social and cultural conditioning. Now, both theories are controversial and imperfect. Biological determinism has been criticized by some as undervaluing the role of social factors and conditions that individuals experience during their lifetime. And social constructivism has been repudiated by many, if not all, LGBTQ activists who explain that through their own lived experiences, as well as through the legendary verse by Lady Gaga that we were born this way. But what the activists, what the critics of the social constructivist model are really more acutely responding to is how that model of sexuality has been used and endorsed by patriarchal culture as a means of proving once and for all that socially disfavored sexualities can be unlearned and surrendered. Thus, social constructivism has been used as a pseudoscience, really, that justifies the use of unethical and loathsome medical practices that we've seen throughout history, such as castration, gay conversion or reparative therapy, electroshock treatment, and others. And that's really where the heart of the critique of social constructivism is directed at. So, although the social constructivist model, the model has been adopted by the patriarchy to justify, really extremely harmful and cruel tactics. It would be a mistake to entirely discount the role of society and the media in one's sexual identity and orientation. Now, if we were to do this, we would be overlooking one of the most visible forms of oppression practiced from the very beginning of human civilization and to this day, and that practice is, of course, homophobia. Now, in his theory of human sexuality, Sigmund Freud, who we talked a little bit about in the last lecture, theorized that homophobia was basically a defense mechanism against one's own homosexual tendencies. Now, Freud suggested that the cultural climate of homophobia rendered consciously heterosexual individuals to be frightened and disturbed by any unconscious homosexual impulse or desire. Now, critics of Freud might point out that such a theory assumes that one's sexual orientation may be undefined before external social forces shape one's innermost sexual identity, and this is basically the dictionary definition of social constructivism. But Freud's theory is relevant because it's also a very vivid example of othering, the vocabulary term from Lecture 4, which referred to the ways that privileged social groups displace their own feelings of inadequacy and shame upon other, less privileged groups of people. Now, Freud called this compulsive hatred of homosexuals ego-dystonic homosexuality, and the term that we would probably more commonly use today is closeted, which refers to the ways in which patriarchal society's intolerance toward homosexuality inhibits and constrains those who question their own sexual feelings. Now, most American media today, as we probably know, conscientiously reinforces heterosexual relationships as normal, normative, and something to be celebrated and cherished and upheld. The privileging of heterosexual unions is what we call heterosexism. Now, heterosexism reinforces the patriarchy, and it functions as a way to enforce the binary opposition of traditional gender roles, which, as we saw in the last lecture, ultimately endorse the idea of superiority of men over women. And homophobia also works to silence the idea that gender roles are not static and hierarchical, but fluid and equal. Now, as you guys have seen or will see in the celluloid closet, homophobia was so endemic to American culture that the Hollywood Production Code of 1930 actually prohibited filmmakers from filming any displays of non-heterosexual unions or characters or storylines. And as a result, filmmakers and actors of the 1930s and 40s, many of whom were closeted themselves and privately endorsed gay rights, were creative and skirted around these rules. Although they could not be explicitly depicted, gay and lesbian characters were nonetheless characterized in coded and connotative ways. Now, the term connotation refers to implying or suggesting something rather than saying it out loud. So, unlike the Tom or the Mammy or the El Bandido, which we saw in the last few weeks, which were all highly visible, explicit, and denotative, gay and lesbian characters were never publicly declaring their sexual orientations on screen. Instead, they were carefully coded in visual ways which made their non-heterosexuality or queerness clear to discerning audiences. A fastidiously dressed and slightly built man with a mustache who talked with clipped speech, for example, would be indicative of a gay man. A woman who wore men's outfits and behaved in stereotypically male ways, like smoking cigarettes or seeking economic, political, and social power, might be coded as a lesbian. As the celluloid closet also showed, many of these connotations, while perhaps working in more discrete and subtextual levels, were still largely caricatured, embellished, and representative of the patriarchal beliefs of heterosexism and homophobia. But what's interesting is that they also made LBGT characters visible for the first time, and this is also discussed in the celluloid closet. And in the generations since these films came out, many of these coded connotative characters have actually been embraced and reframed by queer audiences in a more favorable light. Finally, we're going to look at one marginalized group that we're going to be looking at Friday. And this is individuals identifying as transgender or trans. Now, the term transgender was proposed in the late 70s, and it was proposed to replace the term transsexual because people who did not identify as cisgender, that is, belonging to the same gender, the same sex that they were born with, were not capable of fully changing their biological sex. Now, again, people that were not cisgender were not always capable of changing their biological sex, no matter what they did to modify their bodies. So the term transgender challenges the assumption that there are only two genders, that a person's gender never changes, and that genitals are the essential marker of gender. Now, some transgender individuals assert that they do not need to modify their their genitals to belong as a member of a different gender. This is different from intersex or intersexuality, which refers to a lack of concordance among genitals, gonads, or chromosomes. Now, because transgender individuals do not all carry a uniform sexual orientation, their portrayal in media, even today's media, has been particularly marginalized and harmful. And mainly, you see transgender individuals depicted as sexual deviants whose biological nonconformity is really just a reflection of their own social abnormality. So, the film for Friday is Tangerine. And, at first glance, Tangerine might seem to reinforce a lot of the negative stereotypes about transgender individuals in the media. But as you watch the film, and you're absorbing it, I want you to critically think about whether the characters, particularly the two main characters in the film, Cindy and Alexandra, whether they represent a positive and complex characterization of transcultured and transgendered individuals, or a stereotyped and essentialized one. And this is a very difficult question to answer in a simplistic way because there are arguments on both sides. So that is the conclusion of Lecture 6, due Sunday. I will see you later in